Last summer, I decided I wanted to make my first Steam game. I had many concepts, but I couldn't get started on anything. My ideas were just too big, and I kept second-guessing small creative decisions. So, with time running out, I knew I would have to challenge myself in order to get something finished. Pirate Software, or Thor, is a game dev streamer that you may recognize either from his motivational YouTube shorts or possibly from his more recent controversies. Last summer, he hosted a 2-week-long game jam with over 15,000 people and 2,300 games. This was just the challenge I was looking for. I signed up with the intention that I would make a prototype for my first Steam game. However, that's not quite what happened. Now, though I'd participated in game jams before, this time was different. Firstly, I normally participate in shorter jams, around 3 days in length, so 2 weeks was longer than I was used to. Secondly, I decided to do this jam alone. Normally, I at least team up with my friend Golden Disguise, who does all of the art for our games. However, here I wanted to go alone because I was planning to turn this into my first Steam game, and in order to make a Steam game with him, I would have wanted to make a business or partnership with him. But since he was only 17, it was unadvisable for me to do so. So my only options were to wait until he turned 18 in order to make a business with him, or create my first Steam game alone. And I decided I just didn't want to wait, so I signed up for the 15th Pirate Software Jam. And then I saw another jam. This jam was unique. Instead of a game jam, it was a soundtrack jam. Specifically, it was the 7th OST Composing Jam. The goal was to make a soundtrack for a hypothetical game given a theme, and then judges would rate the soundtracks. No game would be created for the jam, just a game idea and the soundtrack. Now, I had started getting into creating music about a year prior, but I hadn't gotten a chance to really share much of it. I started making music using a great website called Beatbox, but I was now learning FL Studio, and though I wasn't very good yet, I thought this jam might be a great way to improve. However, the end of it slightly overlapped with the Pirate Software Jam, so I guess I couldn't participate. Oh well. Unless I had a crazy idea. What if I participated in both jams and used my soundtrack for the game jam? Now, immediately, this idea might seem crazy. I mean, both jams have their own themes. What if they conflict? Well, I decided it was worth the risk. Not only were there about 4 days of overlap where I would know both themes, but also, worst case, I could just submit a half-baked soundtrack and just not use it for the game jam. It wasn't a big deal either way for me. It just seemed like a fun additional challenge. However, as the time approached, all the stuff I'd signed up for started to hit me. A 2-week jam while I have class and a summer job and another jam at the same time? What had I got myself into? Well, it was too late to turn back now. As I went to bed the night before the soundtrack jam theme would be announced, I thought about what the theme might be. This theme would not only influence my soundtrack, but also my first Steam game. I had to hope it was vague, or at least open to interpretation, or else this soundtrack jam might just be a waste of my time. I woke up the next morning and ran to my computer to see the theme. Inside My World. It was perfect. Not only was it objectively cool as hell, but it also left a lot to be interpreted, and I really didn't see how it could possibly conflict with whatever the theme for the game jam might be. However, the real reason I like this theme so much is because it reminded me of a particular game idea. Remember how I said my game ideas were too big and intimidating? Well, one in particular, my dream game, was really intimidating. It was this narrative-driven game that would take a lot of inspiration from games like Night in the Woods, Undertale, Celeste, and others. And I'd been trying to get the story right for this game for years, but I could never decide on anything. I must have rewritten the story like 10 times. However, this theme immediately made me return to the idea and think about how I could use this game jam as an opportunity to finally break my writer's block. I tried not to get too attached to this idea though, since the game jam theme could still come in and totally ruin it, but I was getting pretty excited. I did work on some songs at this stage, but ultimately I decided to wait for the game jam theme to be announced. 5 days later, I went to bed, eagerly anticipating what the theme would turn out to be. The next morning, I turned on my computer and saw the theme. Shadows and alchemy. This theme I was not as sure of. It didn't immediately conflict with my idea, but I also didn't see an easy way to implement it. I mean, shadows and alchemy? The alchemy bit didn't really mesh well with my story idea, and on top of that, I just didn't really like the theme that much. It felt like two decent but ultimately unrelated themes mashed together. And that is actually what it was. They were the two most voted themes that for some reason were just combined. Whatever, I wasn't gonna let a subpar theme stop me. I saw on the Game Jam page several possible interpretations for the theme, and one particular interpretation of alchemy really intrigued me. Change, transformation. Now that I could work into my story. So I started to frame my story around the idea of things changing in shadow, and things started clicking into place. Soon, I had a fully fledged game idea for the hiding place. You would wake up trapped in this mysterious place called, well, the hiding place, that you would explore, learning about your past through dialogues and flashbacks. The game would ultimately be story-driven, and the gameplay genre would be puzzle platformer, although I wasn't wedded to this at first. What I was wedded to was the idea of things changing in shadow. I whipped together this quick prototype where an object appeared and disappeared as it went in and out of your field of view, and it seemed really cool. The platformer bit honestly just came from the fact that my original story game idea had always just been a platformer in my mind, akin to Night in the Woods. In addition, I decided to draft a first version of my story. Now, even though this didn't end up being the final story, it does definitely contain spoilers, so if you want to play the game without spoilers, pause now and play. Have you played? Okay, good. Here it is. If you want, you can pause, but all you need to know was this was simply the first version of the story that I needed to make for the soundtrack jam. In the end, I made 4 songs for the soundtrack. One, called Hidden, was the main theme, which ended up being used for the main menu and the opening cutscene. Another, called Hiding Place, was the gameplay theme, which was slower, meant to accompany slow puzzle solving. Then there was All My Fault, which was a dramatic piece designed for the big reveal where the player finds out Belle, the main character, unalived herself. And lastly, I'm Not Hiding Anymore, which was the final boss track. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the songs turned out. I made heavy use of motifs in the songs, although I'm not sure if I would call them light motifs, as they aren't really related to particular elements in the story. Regardless, I submitted them to the soundtrack jam just as it ended. At this point, 4 days of the game jam had already passed, so I had about 10 days left to work on the majority of the game. So I got started right away. First, I tackled the player. I started by creating the character art for Belle in this program called Algodo, which is not at all designed for making art, but if you're familiar at all with any of my previous work, you might understand why I made this decision. Simply put, I know how to use Algodo, and also I was going for sort of a geometric art style anyway, so I think it worked out well. Then I animated her using 2D bones in Unity, which took me a whole day, since I'm not great at animation. However, despite that, I think they turned out pretty good. And with those animations, combined with some platforming code and the main mechanic, the game looked like this. To make the whole appearing and disappearing thing as smooth as possible, I added some ray casts into the shadow casting code URP provided, which I worried would be laggy, but it actually wasn't too bad. So the game was looking pretty good. However, there was a slight problem. The game didn't feel good. And yet, I didn't have enough time to dwell on it because I needed to move on immediately and focus on what really mattered, the story, using my remaining week. And that week wasn't actually even a full week. When you account for the fact that I had 2 days of work and school to deal with, I actually only had 5 days left. This means I had less than half of the original Game Jam time to create the entire story for my story game. It's like spending over half of your time drawing the circle, and now it's time to draw the rest of the fucking owl. So, needless to say, I had my work cut out for me. After my 2-day break from the jam, I decided to make a game design document. Not only was this a requirement for the jam, but it also gave me the opportunity to finalize the scope of the game. I decided, given the time left, I would have to tell the character's backstory in just 4 cutscenes. An opening scene, 2 flashbacks, and the aforementioned revelation scene. These scenes would have to have no gameplay, just dialogue and a static background, because even though I wanted gameplay, I just didn't have enough time to implement it, given the time constraints. Since the story was my focus, I started on these scenes right away. For dialogue, I used Yarn Spinner, which is a great dialogue system that I've used before and was used in the game Night in the Woods, one of my inspirations. Then I started on the backgrounds for the cutscenes. I was hoping to get all the backgrounds done in just a couple of days, but in one whole day, I didn't even finish one, which wasn't a good sign. However, I am really happy with how this background turned out, so I think the time spent was worth it. Since the background art was taking so long, I decided to move on to finishing up character art. In addition to the main character, Belle, I made 5 other characters. Belle's mother, Belle's sister, Rain, 2 school friends who ended up going unused, and Belle's younger self. Now, Belle's younger self was not originally planned, but early on I decided to add her as a sort of guide to the hiding place, a narrative thread connecting the hiding place to the flashbacks. However, to add her, I had to add small dialogue scenes into the hiding place. Luckily, these ended up being pretty easy because of Yarnspinner's ability to give commands that would call functions in the game, like characters moving left or right, camera fading, etc. Using those methods, I quickly made most of the first level where you meet young Belle. Now, at this point, I had only 3 full days left, and when I realized how little time I had, I kinda panicked. So I made a much more in-depth plan for the remaining 3 days, outlining exactly when I would finish all of the remaining features in order to finish the game on time. This ended up being vital to the completion of the game. Waking up with a newfound confidence, I immediately got to work by finishing the opening cutscene and first level, and finally started work on gameplay levels. However, quickly the issue of the game not feeling right came up again. I quickly realized this was at least partly because of the light coming from you, so I decided to ditch that and instead make light switches. This fixed my design issue, but made the game far less complex. I ended up adding back the whole light coming from you thing in the form of an item you get for later levels, but that didn't feel good either. Overall, I was just really unhappy with the gameplay, but I just didn't have the time to focus on fixing it. Instead, I went back to the cutscenes. The second cutscene luckily took way less time than the first, and I was able to finish it in just a few hours. Then, before calling it a day, I made the scene where you find out the person you had been following is actually a younger version of you, and when you're introduced to the big bad, your own self-hatred. This scene had a lot of moving parts, so I only got started on it this day before I ran out of time. The next day, I quickly finished up the scene. To finish it, I had to create a new animation where you and your younger self tussle with the award they won. The idea here was that the tussle would prompt Belle to start berating herself because she got mad at your younger self, and then that would summon her self-hatred, the big monster. Overall, I was pretty proud of this scene, so even though it took a bit of extra time, I think it was worth it. The thing that took the most time was the self-hatred monster. I was able to reuse the procedural animation logic controlling Belle's hair on the tentacles, but making the whole monster move was a real challenge. I spent some time trying to make the tentacles collide with the walls, but this proved to be too difficult, so I ended up giving up on it and ultimately throwing that time away, which really sucked. Next, I did the third cutscene. It had a cool opening that I'm pretty happy with, and luckily it didn't take much time. And then I did a scene with Belle's sister, Rain. In this scene, I actually hid a little Easter egg, a bit of foreshadowing. I wonder if you can find it. Then I made a chase scene with the self-hatred monster, and a couple more gameplay scenes. Because I had already made the monster, the chase scene didn't take long to make. However, the gameplay scene saw the return of the whole light coming from you mechanic in the form of an orb that you could pick up and throw, which could also be used as a weapon later in the boss fight. Lastly, I finished the day off by working on a small interaction with Belle's mom. This was a pretty dramatic scene, and I'm gonna be real, I was getting pretty emotional writing it. It was the end of the day now, midnight, and I had only about 24 hours left before the end of the jam, before I would submit this game to the world, this game that was my shot at making my dream story game. I was ready. As you can see from this list, I did a lot this day. I woke up at 6 a.m., giving me exactly 24 hours to finish the game. I was ready. I started by fixing some bugs with my previous work and created the scene where the self-hatred corners you. This took a little longer than I was hoping, but I still had some time left in the morning, so I decided to tackle the revelation scene, where the player finds out Belle unalived herself. This proved to be a difficult scene. Luckily, I had a pretty good vision for what I wanted this scene to look like pretty early on, so in the end it took me about 5 hours to make, which was totally worth it. That cutscene is definitely my favorite part of the game. I'm really proud with how it turned out. I ended up making a new song for it as well, which acted as the build-up into the song that I made for this scene in the soundtrack jam. Although I did have to shorten that song a little bit to fit the actual length of the scene. After finishing that scene, all that was left was the final boss. Now, instead of a boss fight, I planned to have a puzzle while the boss was slowly chasing you around the room. However, this ended up being not very fun, and pretty buggy. The boss got stuck a lot. So instead, I just made the boss move up and down as a basic obstacle while you solve the puzzle. It wasn't great, but I really didn't have time to make anything better. After finding 3 orbs and hitting it 3 times, it would run away, triggering the final little scene, and then the end of the game. So I had finally completed the main story, but unfortunately, not the whole game. With the last remaining hours, I scrambled together the last bits of the game. The main menu, some last music tracks, sound effects, things like that. And after all of that, it was about 2 a.m. The jam was ending in just 4 hours. So I spent what little time I had left playtesting and polishing the game, before finally at 4 a.m. submitting it. And immediately noticing an issue. The text in the game didn't show up. This was a major problem, as most of the game was dialogue, and I need to figure this out fast. Luckily, I quickly found that the issue was browser dependent, and playing the game in Firefox fixed the issue for me. I tried to see if there was any other solutions, but I couldn't figure out any quick enough, so I just added a note in the description of the game saying that it worked best in Firefox, and then called it a night. I had done it. The game was finally complete, and I was really proud of it. I still am really proud of it. I really love how the story and in particular the art turned out. As mentioned before, I am not an artist. Most of my games have been made with the help of my animator friend Golden Skies, who basically does all of the art for my other games. So I wasn't sure at all how the art would turn out, but I'm happy to say that I think it turned out alright. The game definitely has some issues though. One was the text issue, but that got fixed as soon as the voting period was over. The real issue was the gameplay. The game mechanics just were never really the focus of the game idea, and I think it shows. The puzzles just don't make use of the mechanics super well, and that's partially because the mechanics were just really difficult to make puzzles for. In addition, I think the boss fight is really lackluster. I wish I did something more interesting with it, but given how much time I had left when I started working on it, it's understandable it ended up being half-baked. Overall though, I consider the game a success. But what did others think of it? Did the Game Jam judges see it as a success? Well, yes, sort of. You see, unlike most jams, where the developers double as judges, there was a dedicated team of judges who would rate the games. The idea was that this would prevent review bombing, however, instead it brought a new issue. There were far more games than judges, so each game only got 1 review on average, which, in my opinion, led to a much worse situation than if they just used developers for the judges. With only 1 review, you are totally dependent on the judge you got. It just wasn't a fair system. But oh well, after the review period was over, I went to check my review. I was ready for anything, and reminding myself that with only 1 review, the opinion was going to be inherently biased. I was not going to be surprised. And yet, somehow, I was surprised. I got full marks. 5 out of 5 stars in all categories. I was ecstatic. Sure, the review was biased, but it literally was as well as I possibly could have done. Score-wise, it made my game tied for first with around 50 other games. But it wasn't over yet. There was still 1 stage left. The judges were going to go through a list of 50 favorites and narrow it down to a top 10. Because the number of games with a perfect score was around 50, I figured my game must be in contention for the top 10. So I was unbelievably excited. My game might be shown on stream and shouted out by Thor himself. So when the top 10 were announced, let's just say I was a bit disappointed to find out that my game may not have even been in the running. Not only was my game not in the top 10, but a majority of the games in the top 10 didn't even get full marks. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. The judges can pick games however they want. But I cannot lie, it did feel like it invalidated my perfect score. What was the point of getting a perfect score if they were just going to pick games on other criteria? I never did find out if my game was in the top 50. since they never released a list of the games they were considering. And overall, even with a good score, I just felt unsatisfied. Sure, I did well, but only according to one person. In general, I'm just not a big fan with how this jam was formatted. However, I'm still really happy with how my game did. I got some great feedback and a lot of people connected with the story, which is ultimately what I cared about most. I had finally put a good step forward in the creation of my dream game. And in the soundtrack jam, despite not doing very well, I still got a lot of nice feedback and got to share my music. So finally, that wraps up the story and brings us to today. You might be wondering what happened to turning this into my first Steam game, and why is this video so late? Well, while turning this game into a Steam game was my intention when I finished, I soon realized that I was conflicted on actually following through. You see, this game was very similar to the dream game I had been imagining, but not quite the same. It is definitely a good game in its own right, and one that ideally would get a Steam release, but if I were to go forward with that, I might never feel the need to make my dream game. I don't know if that makes sense. Ultimately, I just decided this game wasn't it. With that being said, I'm not content leaving the hiding place as it is, or at least I'm not content with leaving behind the idea of making a game like it, since I still really want to make my dream game. The hiding place was a good practice run towards doing that, but ultimately it didn't lead to the game I wanted to create. But that's okay, I'm still really proud of what I did create. As far as why this video is so late, it's mainly because of school. However, I've also been working on other projects during this time, including a game that I am planning to turn into my first actual Steam game. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing. Also, if you've somehow gotten this far into the video and haven't tried the game, I would really appreciate it if you would give it a try. It isn't long, about 30-ish minutes, and I put a lot of effort into it. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thanks for watching. Bye!